The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 1, Continued, Cassette 7, Side 2. The most valiant opponent of the Turks in the second half of the 15th century was Skanderbeg of Albania. His real name was George of Castriota, and he was probably of modest Slavonian lineage, but legends precious to his people endow him with royal Epirote blood and an adventurous youth. In his boyhood, we are told, he was given as hostage to Murad II, and was brought up at the Adrianople court of the Ottomans. The Sultan so liked his courage and bearing that he treated him as a son, and made him an officer in the Turkish army. Converted to Mohammedanism, George received the mighty name of Iskender Bey, that is, Alexander the Prince, which busy time shortened to Skanderbeg. After leading the Turks in many battles against the Christians, he repented his apostasy and plotted escape. He renounced Islam, seized the Albanian capital Kruja from its Turkish governor, and proclaimed revolt in 1442. Muhammad sent army after army to chasten him. Skanderbeg defeated them all by the rapidity of his military movements and the genius of his elusive strategy. Finally, Muhammad, distracted by larger wars, gave him a 10-year armistice in 1461. But the Venetian Senate and Pope Pius II persuaded Skanderbeg to break the truce and renew the war in 1463. Muhammad, denouncing the Christians as literally faithless infidels, returned to the siege of Kruja. Skanderbeg defended it so tenaciously that the Sultan again raised the siege. But amid the debris of victory, Skanderbeg died in 1468. Kruja surrendered in 1479, and Albania became a province of Turkey. Meanwhile, the insatiable Muhammad absorbed the Morea, Trebizond, Lesbos, Negroponte, the old Euboea, and the Crimea. In 1477, one of his armies crossed the Isonzo, ravaged northeastern Italy to within 22 miles of Venice, and then, laden with booty, returned into Serbia. Frightened Venice, which had fought long and tenaciously for its possessions in the Aegean and the Adriatic, yielded all claim to Kruja and Scutari, and paid an indemnity of 10,000 ducats. Western Europe, which had failed to help Venice, denounced her for making and keeping peace with the infidel. The Turks had now reached the Adriatic, and only the waters that Caesar had crossed in a rowboat separated them from Italy, Rome, and the Vatican. In 1480, Muhammad sent an army across these waters to attack the kingdom of Naples. It took Otranto with ease, massacred half the 22,000 inhabitants, enslaved the rest, and cut an archbishop in two. The fate of Christianity and monogamy teetered in the scales. Ferrante of Naples ended his war with Florence and sent his best forces to recapture Otranto. Muhammad had entangled himself in besieging Rhodes. Amid that enterprise he died. Rhodes remained Christian till Suleiman. The Turks left Otranto and retired into Albania in 1481. The Ottoman tide for a moment ceased to flow. 6. The Hungarian Renaissance, 1456 to 1490. In the half-century of security that Hunyadi had won for Hungary, his son Matthias Corvinus led the nation to its historic culmination. Matthias was only 16 at his accession, and not entirely royal in form. His legs were too short for his trunk, so that he seemed tall only when on a horse. However, he had the chest and arms, the strength and courage of a gladiator. Not long after his coronation, he challenged to single combat a German knight of massive frame and power, who, in a tournament at Buda, had felled all competitors, and Matthias threatened to have him executed if he failed to fight with all his vigor and skill. The Hungarian historians assure us that the young king, aided by the horns of this dilemma, decisively vanquished the giant. Matthias matured into a good soldier and general, defeated the Turks wherever he encountered them, absorbed Moravia and Silesia, failed to conquer Bohemia. He fought 4 wars against the Emperor Frederick III, took Vienna, and annexed Austria in 1485. The first Austro-Hungarian Empire was Hungarian. His victories made the monarchy transiently supreme over the nobility. Here, as in Western Europe, centralization of government was the order of the day. At Buda and in the king's palace at Visegrad, his court equaled any royal grandeur of the age. Great noblemen became his servitors. His ambassadors were noted for the splendor of their dress, equipage, and retinue. Matthias's diplomacy was cunning and unscrupulous, amiable and generous. He bought with gold what would have cost twice as much by arms. Meanwhile, he found time and zest to restore every department of the government and to labor in person as a careful administrator and impartial judge. Roaming in disguise among the people, the soldiery, and the courts, he inspected at first hand the behavior of his officials and corrected incompetence and injustice without favoritism or fear. He did what he could to protect the weak from the strong, the peasants from their rapacious lords. While the Church continued to claim the country as papal property, Matthias appointed and disciplined prelates and enjoyed the furor when he made a 7-year-old Italian lad the primate of Hungary. The merchants of Ferrara, with rival humor, sent the new archbishop an assortment of toys. In 1476, Matthias married Beatrice of Aragon and welcomed to Hungary the gay Neapolitan spirit and refined Italian tastes of the granddaughter of Alfonso the Magnanimous. Intercourse between Hungary and Naples had been encouraged by the Angevin kinship of their kings, and many men at the Buda court had been educated in Italy. Matthias himself resembled the Italian Renaissance despots in his cultural proclivities as well as his Machiavellian statecraft. Lorenzo de' Medici sent him 2 bronze reliefs by Verrocchio, and Lodovico il Moro commissioned Leonardo da Vinci to paint a Madonna for the Hungarian king, assuring the artist that he is able to value a great picture as few men can. Filippino Lippi turned out another Madonna for Corvinus, and his pupils adorned with frescoes the royal palace at Esztergom. An Italian sculptor made a pretty bust of Beatrice. Probably the famous Milanese goldsmith Caradossa designed the masterly Calvary of Esztergom. Benedetto da Maiana carved decorations for the palace at Buda, and divers Italians built the Renaissance-style tabernacle in the parish church of the inner city of the capital. Nobles and prelates joined the king in supporting artists and scholars. Even the mining towns of the interior had rich men who sublimated wealth into art. Handsome buildings, civic as well as ecclesiastical, rose not only at Buda, but at Visegrad, Tata, Esztergom, Nagyvarad, and Vats. Hundreds of sculptors and painters ornamented these edifices. Giovanni Dalmata made notable statues of Hunyadi János and other Hungarian heroes. At Kassa, a veritable school of artists formed. There, for the high altar of the church of St. Elizabeth, Master Stephen and others carved, from 1474 to 1477, an immense and complex reredos, whose central figures are quite Italian in their refinement and grace. In the parish church of Beszterce-Bánya, another group carved in stone a great relief, Christ in the Garden of Olives, astonishing in its careful details and dramatic effect. A similar vigor of expression and artistry appears in the Hungarian paintings that survive from this age, as in the Mary Visiting Elizabeth by Master M.S., now in the Budapest Museum. Almost all the art of this Hungarian heyday was destroyed or lost in the Ottoman invasions of the 16th century. Some of the statues are in Istanbul, to which they were carried by the victorious Turks. Matthias's interests were literary rather than artistic. Humanists, foreign or native, were welcomed at his court and received lucrative sinecures in the government. Antonio Bonfini wrote a history of the reign in a Latin modeled on Livy. János Vitéz, Archbishop of Gran, collected a library of ancient classics and provided funds to send young scholars to study Greek in Italy. One of these, János Pannonius, spent 7 years at Ferrara, won admission to Lorenzo's circle at Florence, and back in Hungary astonished the court with his Latin verses and Greek discourses. When Pannonius spoke Greek, wrote Bonfini, you would think he must have been born in Athens. Probably in Italy alone could one find, in the last quarter of the 15th century, such a galaxy of artists and scholars as received sustenance at Matthias's court. The Sodalitas Literaria Danubia, founded at Buda in 1497, is among the oldest literary societies in the world. Like his Medici contemporaries, Corvinus collected art and books. His palace became a museum of statuary and objets d'art. Tradition has it that he spent 30,000 florins, or about $750,000 yearly on books, which in many cases were costly illuminated manuscripts. Yet he did not, like Federigo de Montefeltro, reject printed works. A press was established at Buda in 1473, 3 years before printing reached England. The Bibliotheca Corvina, which held 10,000 volumes when Matthias died, was the finest 15th-century library outside of Italy. It was housed in his Buda palace in 2 spacious halls, with windows of stained glass looking on the Danube. The shelves were richly carved, and the books, mostly bound in vellum, were curtained with velvet tapestries. Matthias seems to have read some of the books. At least he used Livy to induce sleep, and he wrote to a humanist, "O scholars, how happy you are! You strive not after blood-stained glory, nor monarchs' crowns, but for the laurels of poetry and virtue. You are even able to compel us to forget the tumult of war." The centralized power that Matthias had organized only briefly survived his death in 1490. The resurgent magnates dominated Ladislas II and embezzled revenues that should have paid the troops. The army mutinied, the soldiers went home. Freed from taxation, the nobles wasted their income and energies in riotous living, while Islam pressed against the borders and a bitterly exploited peasantry seethed with revolt. In 1514, the Hungarian Diet declared a crusade against the Turks and called for volunteers. Peasants in great number flocked to the cross, seeing little to choose between life and death. Finding themselves armed, the thought spread among them, why wait to kill distant Turks when hated nobles were so near? A soldier of fortune, Gheorghe Dosha, led them in a wild jacquerie. They overran all Hungary, burning castles and massacring all nobles, men, women, children, who fell into their hands. The nobles called in aid from all directions, armed and paid mercenaries, overwhelmed the disorganized peasants, and punished their leaders with frightful torments. For 2 weeks Dosha and his aides were kept without food. Then he was tied to a red-hot iron throne, a red-hot crown was placed upon his head, a red-hot scepter forced into his hand, and his starved companions were allowed to tear the roasted flesh from his body while he was still conscious. From barbarism to civilization requires a century. From civilization to barbarism needs but a day. The peasants were not slaughtered, for they were indispensable, but the tripartite code of 1514 decreed that the recent rebellion has for all time to come put the stain of faithlessness upon the peasants, and they have thereby forfeited their liberty and have become subject to their lords in unconditional and perpetual servitude. Every species of property belongs to the landlords, and the peasant has no right to invoke justice and the law against a noble. 12 years later, Hungary fell to the Turks. Chapter 10. Portugal inaugurates the Commercial Revolution, 1300 to 1517. Through no natural advantages except a sea-coast, but by sheer courage and tenacious enterprise, little Portugal in this period made herself one of the strongest and richest of European states. Founded as a kingdom in 1139, her government, language, and culture reached an established form under her best-beloved ruler, Dinis the Laborer, administrator, reformer, builder, educator, patron of the arts, and skilled practitioner of literature and love. His son, Afonso IV, after some precautionary murders, matured into a beneficent reign in which a growing trade with England bound the 2 countries into a political amity that has endured till our time. To confirm a prudent alliance with rising Castile, Afonso urged his son Pedro to marry Dona Costanza Manuel. Pedro married her, but continued to love the lovely Inés de Castro, herself of royal lineage. After Costanza's death, Inés was an obstacle to a second diplomatic marriage for Pedro. Afonso, after due reluctance, had her killed in 1355. Camões, the Portuguese Milton, recounted this famous romance in his national epic, the Lusíads. So against Inés came that murderous crew, the brutes their swords in her white breasts imbrue, and in mad wrath themselves incarnadine, nor any vengeance yet to come divine. Pedro supplied the vengeance when, 2 years later, he inherited the throne. He murdered the murderers, exhumed the corpse of his beloved, crowned her queen, and then reburied her in regal style. He ruled with a severity nurtured by this tragedy. A less exalted romance disordered the reign of his successor. Fernando I lost his head and heart to Leonora, wife of the Lord of Pombero, repudiated his engagement to a Castilian princess, and married Leonora despite her living husband and a scandalized church. After Fernando's death in 1383, Leonora assumed the regency, made her daughter Beatrice the queen, and betrothed her to John I of Castile. The people revolted against the prospect of becoming a Castilian appanage, a Cortes at Coimbra, declared the Portuguese throne elective and chose as king Dom João, John, son of Pedro and Inês. Castile undertook to establish Beatriz by force. John improvised an army, borrowed 500 archers from England, and defeated the Castilians at Aljubarrota on August 14, 1385, which is annually celebrated as Portugal's Independence Day. John the Great now opened a reign of 48 years and a dynasty, the House of Avish, that held the throne for 2 centuries. Administration was reorganized, law and the judiciary were reformed, the Portuguese language was made official, and its literature began. Scholars here, as in Spain, continued till the 18th century to use Latin, but Vasco de Lobera wrote in the native tongue a chivalric romance, Amadis da Gaula, circa 1400, which became in translation the most popular secular book in Europe. National art expressed itself proudly in the Church of Santa Maria da Victoria, built at Batalha by John I to commemorate the Battle of Aljubarrota. Here Milan's cathedral is rivaled in size, and Notre Dame of Paris in the intricate splendor of buttresses and pinnacles. In 1436 a chapel of elegant design and decoration was added to receive the remains of the bastard king. He was honored in his sons. Duarte, Edward, succeeded him and governed almost as well. Pedro codified the law. Enrique, Henry the Navigator, inaugurated the commercial revolution that was to transform the map of the globe. When John I captured Ceuta from the Moors in 1415, he left the 21-year-old Henry as governor of that strategic stronghold, just across the strait from Gibraltar. Excited by Moslem accounts of Timbuktu and Senegal, and the gold, ivory, and slaves to be had along the West African coast, the ambitious youth determined to explore that terrain and add it to Portugal. The Senegal River that his informants spoke of might lead eastward to the headwaters of the Nile and to Christian Abyssinia. A water route would be opened across Africa from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, therefore to India. The Italian monopoly of trade with the East would be broken. Portugal would be a major power. The conquered region might be converted to Christianity, and African Islam would be flanked on north and south by Christian states, and the Mediterranean become safe for Christian navigation. Henry does not appear to have thought of a route around Africa, but that was the historic result of his work. About 1420 he set up at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal and Europe, an informal clearinghouse of nautical knowledge and enterprise. For 40 years he and his aides, including Jewish and Moslem astronomers and map-makers, gathered and studied there the accounts of sailors and travelers, and sent out into perilous seas frail vessels powered with sails and oars and 30 to 60 men. One of Henry's captains had already, in 1418, rediscovered Madeira, which had been seen by Genoese mariners 70 years before and then forgotten. Now Portuguese colonists developed its resources. Soon its sugar and other products repaid the cost of colonization and encouraged the Portuguese government to meet Henry's appeals for funds. Noting the Azores marked on an Italian map of 1351, he commissioned Gonçalo Cabral to find them. It was done, and in 1432 to 1444, one after another, these jewels of the sea were added to the Portuguese crown. But it was Africa that lured Henry most insistently. Catalan and Portuguese navigators had sailed some 900 miles down the west coast as far as Bojador between 1341 and 1346. There, however, the enormous westward bulge of the great continent into the Atlantic disheartened mariners seeking the south. They crept back to Europe with self-excusing tales of horrible natives, a sea so thick with salt that no prow would cleave it, and assurances that any Christian who passed Bojador would be transformed into a Negro. With similar apologies, Captain Gilianes returned to Sagres in 1433. Henry ordered him forth again, and bade him bring back a clear account of the lands and seas south of the forbidding cape. So prodded, Gilianes reached to 150 miles beyond Bojador in 1435, and was astonished to find lush vegetation in equatorial regions where, according to Aristotle and Ptolemy, only deserts could exist under the burning sun. 6 years later, Nuno Tristão sailed down to Capo Blanco and brought home some sturdy Negroes who were at once baptized and enslaved. Feudal barons put them to work on Portuguese plantations, and the first major result of Henry's labors was the inauguration of the African slave trade. Fresh financial support now came to the prince. His ships went out nominally to explore and convert, really to get gold, ivory, and slaves. Captain Lanzarote in 1444 brought back 165 blackamoors, who were set to tilling the lands of the monastic military order of Jesus Christ. A Portuguese contemporary described the capture of these black Moors. Our men, crying out, "Santiago, San Jorge, Portugal," fell upon them, killing or capturing all they could. There you might have seen mothers catch up their children, husbands their wives, each one escaping as best he could. Some plunged into the sea, others thought to hide themselves in the corners of their hovels. Others hid their children under the shrubs, where our men found them. And at last our Lord God, who gives to all a due reward, gave to our men that day a victory over their enemies, and in recompense for all their toil in his service they took 165 men, women, and children, not counting the slain. By 1448, over 900 African slaves had been brought to Portugal. We should add that the Moslems of North Africa had anticipated the Christians in developing a slave trade, and African Negro chieftains themselves bought Negro slaves from the Portuguese with ivory and gold. Man was a commodity to human beasts of prey. In 1445, Denis Dias reached the fertile promontory named Cape Verde. In 1446, Lanzarote explored the mouth of the Senegal. In 1456, Cadamosta found the Cape Verde Islands. In that year, Prince Henry died, but the enterprise continued with the impetus that he had given it and the economic gains that now financed it. João de Santarém crossed the equator in 1471. Diogo Cao reached the Congo River in 1484. Finally, half a century after Henry's first expedition, Bartolomeu Dias, fighting his way through tempest and shipwreck, rounded the southernmost point of Africa in 1486. He rejoiced to find that he could now sail eastward. India lay straight ahead and seemed almost in his grasp, but his weary men forced him to turn back. Mourning the rough seas that had broken the spirit of his men, he named the southern tip of the continent Cabo Tormentoso. But King John II, seeing India around the bend, renamed the point the Cape of Good Hope. Neither Dias nor the king lived to see fulfilled the dream that now stirred all Portugal, an all-water route to India. In 1497, King Manuel, jealous of the honors and wealth that Columbus was bringing to Spain, commissioned Vasco da Gama to sail around Africa to India. Forced by storms to take a circuitous route, the 28-year-old captain voyaged some 5,000 miles through 137 days to the Cape of Good Hope, then through 100 perils and tribulations, 178 days and 4,500 miles more to Calicut, a main nexus of east-west and north-south trade in Asia. There he anchored on May 20th, 1498, 10 months and 12 days after leaving Lisbon. Landing, he was at once arrested as a pirate and narrowly escaped execution. With remarkable courage and address, he overcame Indian suspicions and Moslem jealousies, won permission for the Portuguese to trade, took on a rich cargo of pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and jewelry, and left Calicut August 29th for an arduous year-long return to Lisbon. The Portuguese had finally found a route to India, free from the costly transshipments and tolls suffered by the sea and land routes from Italy through Egypt or Arabia or Persia. The economic results were to be, for a century, more vital to Europe than those that flowed from the discovery of America. Proud of having reached the real India, while the Spanish navigators were floundering in the supposed Indies of the Caribbean, the Portuguese till 1500 hardly thought of trying a passage west. But in that year, Pedro Cabral, driven from the course that he had set for India via Africa, stumbled upon Brazil. And again in that year, Gaspar Corte Real rediscovered Labrador. In 1503, Amerigo Vespucci, sailing under the Portuguese flag, explored the Rio Plata and Paraguay, and in 1506, Tristão da Cunha found the South Atlantic island that bears his name. Portuguese statesmen, however, saw little profit in Brazil, whereas every cargo from India fattened the royal treasury and the purses of merchants and mariners. The Portuguese government kept full control over the new trade, since the commerce required unremitting military protection. Moslem merchants had long since been established in Indian posts. Some Indian potentates joined them in resisting the Portuguese invasion. Trade and war, money and blood, now mingled in the far-flung commercial revolution. In 1509, Afonso de Albuquerque became the first governor of Portuguese India. Waging campaign after campaign against Moslems and Hindus, he captured and fortified Aden and Hormuz on the Arabian coast, Goa in India, and Malacca in the Malay Peninsula. And from Malacca he brought home 1 million ducats worth of booty. So armed, Portugal became, for 150 years, the master of European trade with India and the East Indies. Portuguese merchants established themselves as far east as the Moluccas in 1512, and rejoiced to find the nutmegs, mace, and cloves of these spice islands tastier and cheaper than India's. Still insatiate, Albuquerque sailed with 20 vessels into the Red Sea and proposed to the Christian king of Abyssinia that they join forces in digging a canal from the Upper Nile to the Red Sea, so diverting the river and turning all Moslem Egypt into a desert. Trouble summoned Albuquerque back to Goa, where he died in 1515. In the following year, Duarte Coelho opened Cochin China and Siam to Portuguese trade. And in 1517, Fernão Peres de Andrade established commercial relations with Canton and Peking. The Portuguese Empire, the first modern imperialism, was now the most extensive in the world, rivaled only by the empire that was being built for Spain in the Americas. Lisbon became a thriving emporium. Those waters harbored ships from romantically distant lands. There, rather than in Venice or Genoa, the merchants of northern Europe now found the lowest prices for Asiatic goods. Italy mourned her lost monopoly of the Oriental trade. Slowly, the Italian Renaissance, mortally stricken by Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Luther in one generation, faded away, while Portugal and Spain, commanders of the open sea, led the flowering of the Atlantic states. Literature and art basked in the new glory. Fernão Lopes, writing for 20 years, between 1434 and 1454, his voluminous Chronicles, told the story of Portugal with a vivacity of narrative and a power of characterization rivaling Froissart. Gil Vicente inaugurated the Portuguese drama with little plays for the court and autos, acts, for public festivals, circa 1500. A Portuguese school of painting developed, taking a lead from Flanders but achieving its own temper and qualities. Nuno Gonçalves, who flourished between 1450 and 1472, rivaled Mantegna and almost the Van Eycks in the somber polyptych that he painted for the convent of St. Vincent. The 6 panels, primitive in perspective and modeling, but the 55 portraits, the best of them, Henry the Navigator, individualized with realistic power. To commemorate the victorious voyage of Vasco da Gama, King Manuel the Fortunate commissioned the architect João de Castilho to build near Lisbon, in flamboyant Gothic, the magnificent monastery of Belém, circa 1500. Portugal had entered her golden age. Chapter 11. Spain, 1300 to 1517. 1. The Spanish Scene, 1300 to 1469. Spain's mountains were her protection and tragedy. They gave her comparative security from external attack, but hindered her economic advance, her political unity, and her participation in European thought. In a little corner of the northwest, a half-nomad population of Basques led their sheep from plains to hills and down again with the diastole and systole of the seasons. Though many Basques were serfs, all claimed nobility, and their 3 provinces governed themselves under the loose sovereignty of Castile or Navarre. Navarre remained a separate kingdom until Ferdinand the Catholic absorbed its southern part into Castile in 1515, while the rest became a kingly appanage of France. Sardinia was appropriated by Aragon in 1326. The Baleares followed in 1354, Sicily in 1409. Aragon itself was enriched by the industry and commerce of Valencia, Tarragona, Saragossa, and Barcelona, capital of the province of Catalonia within the kingdom of Aragon. Castile was the strongest and most extensive of the Spanish monarchies. It ruled the populous cities of Oviedo, León, Burgos, Valladolid, Salamanca, Córdoba, Seville, and Toledo, its capital. Its kings played to the largest audience and for the greatest stakes in Spain. Alfonso XI, who ruled from 1312 to 1350, improved the laws and courts of Castile, deflected the pugnacity of the nobles into wars against the Moors, supported literature and art, and rewarded himself with a fertile mistress. His wife bore him one legitimate son, who grew up in obscurity, neglect, and resentment, and became Pedro el Cruel. Peter's accession at 15 in 1350 so visibly disappointed the 9 bastards of Alfonso that they were all banished, and Leonora de Guzman, their mother, was put to death. When Peter's royal bride, Blanche of Bourbon, arrived unsolicited from France, he married her, spent 2 nights with her, had her poisoned on a charge of conspiracy in 1361, and married his paramour, Maria de Padilla, whose beauty, legend assures us, was so intoxicating that the cavaliers of the court drank with ecstasy the water in which she had bathed. Pedro was popular with the lower classes, which supported him to the very bitter end, but the repeated attempts of his half-brothers to depose him drove him to such a series of treacheries, murders, and sacrileges as would clog and incarnadine any tale. Finally, Henry of Trastamara, Leonora's eldest son, organized a successful revolt, slew Peter with his own hand, and became Henry II of Castile, this in 1369. But we do nations injustice when we judge them from their kings, who agreed with Machiavelli that morals are not made for sovereigns. While the rulers played with murder, individual or nationalized, the people, numbering some 10 million in 1450, created the civilization of Spain. Proud of their pure blood, they were an unstable mixture of Celts, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans, Visigoths, Vandals, Arabs, Berbers, and Jews. At the social bottom were a few slaves and a peasantry that remained serf till 1471. Above them were the artisans, manufacturers, and merchants of the towns. Above these, in rising layers of dignity, were the knights, or caballeros, the nobles, dependent upon the king, the hidalgos, and the independent nobles, or proceres. And alongside these laymen were grades of clergy mounting from parish priests through bishops and abbots to archbishops and cardinals. Every town had its consejo, or council, and sent delegates to join nobles and prelates in provincial and national cortes. In theory, the edicts of the kings required the consent of these courts to become laws. Wages, labor conditions, prices, and interest rates were regulated by municipal councils or the guilds. Trade was hampered by royal monopolies, by state or local tolls on imports and exports, by diverse weights and measures, by debased currencies, highway brigands, Mediterranean pirates, ecclesiastical condemnation of interest, and the persecution of Moslems, who manned most industry and commerce, and Jews, who managed finance. A state bank was opened in Barcelona in 1401 with governmental guarantee of bank deposits. Bills of exchange were issued, and marine insurance was established by 1435. As the Spaniards mingled anti-Semitism with Semitic ancestry, so they retained the heat of Africa in their blood, and were inclined, like the Berbers, to rarity and violence of action and speech. They were sharp and curious of mind, yet eagerly credulous and fearfully superstitious. They sustained a proud independence of spirit and dignity of carriage, even in misfortune and poverty. They were acquisitive, and had to be, but they did not look down upon the poor, or lick the boots of the rich. They despised and deferred labor, but they bore hardship stoically. They were lazy, but they conquered half the New World. They thirsted for adventure, grandeur, and romance. They relished danger, if only by proxy. The bullfight, a relic of Crete and Rome, was already the national game, formal, stately, colorful, exacting, and teaching bravery, artistry, and an agile intelligence. But the Spaniards, like the modern, unlike the Elizabethan, English, took their pleasures sadly. The aridity of the soil and the shadows of the mountain slopes were reflected in a dry somberness of mood. Manners were grave and perfect, much better than hygiene. Every Spaniard was a gentleman, but few were knights of the bath. Chivalric forms and tourneys flourished amid the squalor of the populace. The point of honor became a religion. Women in Spain were goddesses and prisoners. In the upper classes, dress, sober on weekdays, burst into splendor on Sundays and festive occasions, flaunting silks and ruffs and puffs and lace and gold. The men affected perfume and high heels, and the women, not content with their natural sorcery, bewitched the men with color, lace, and mystic veils. In 1,000 forms and disguises the sexual chase went on. Solemn ecclesiastical terrors, lethal laws, and punto de honor struggled to check the mad pursuit, but Venus triumphed over all, and the fertility of women outran the bounty of the soil. The Church in Spain was an inseparable ally of the state. It took small account of the Roman Pope. It made frequent demands for the reform of the papacy, even while contributing to it the unreformable Alexander VI. In 1513, Cardinal Ximenes forbade the promulgation in Spain of the indulgence offered by Julius II for rebuilding St. Peter's. In effect, the king was accepted as the head of the Spanish Church. In this matter, Ferdinand did not wait for Henry VIII to instruct him. No reformation was needed in Spain to make church and state, nationalism and religion, one. As part of the unwritten bargain, the Spanish Church enjoyed substantial prerogatives under a government consciously dependent upon it for maintaining moral order, social stability, and popular docility. Its personnel, even in minor orders, were subject only to ecclesiastical courts. It owned great tracts of land, tilled by tenants. It received 1/10 of the produce of other holdings, but paid 1/3 of this tithe to the exchequer. Otherwise it was exempt from taxation. It was probably richer, in comparison with the state, than in any other country except Italy. Clerical morals and monastic discipline were apparently above the medieval average, but as elsewhere, clerical concubinage was widespread and condoned. Asceticism continued in Spain while declining north of the Pyrenees. Even lovers scourged themselves to melt the resistance of tender, timid senoritas, or to achieve some masochistic ecstasy. The people were fiercely loyal to church and king because they had to be in order to fight with courage and success their immemorable enemies, the Moors. The struggle for Granada was presented as a war for the Holy Faith, Santa Fe. On holy days, men, women, and children, rich and poor, paraded the streets in solemn procession, somberly silent or chanting, behind great dolls, or pasos, representing the Virgin or a saint. They believed intensely in the spiritual world as their real environment and eternal home. Beside it, earthly life was an evil and transitory dream. They hated heretics as traitors to the national unity and cause, and had no objection to burning them. This was the least they could do for their outraged God. The lower classes had hardly any schooling, and this was nearly all religious. Stout Cortes, finding among the pagan Mexicans a rite resembling the Christian Eucharist, complained that Satan had taught it to them just to confuse the conquerors. The intensity of Catholicism in Spain was enhanced by economic competition with Muslims and Jews, who together made up almost 1/10 of the population of Christian Spain. It was bad enough that the Moors held fertile Granada, but more closely irritating were the Mudejares, the unconverted Moors who lived among the Spanish Christians, and whose skill in business, crafts, and agriculture was the envy of a people mostly bound in primitive drudgery to the soil. Even more unforgivable were the Spanish Jews. Christian Spain had persecuted them through 1,000 years, had subjected them to discriminatory taxation, forced loans, confiscations, assassinations, compulsory baptism, had compelled them to listen to Christian sermons, sometimes in their own synagogues, urging their conversion, while the law made it a capital crime for a Christian to accept Judaism. They were invited or conscripted into debates with Christian theologians, where they had to choose between a shameful defeat or a perilous victory. They and the Mudejares had been repeatedly ordered to wear a distinctive badge, usually a red circle on the shoulder of their garments. Jews were forbidden to hire a Christian servant. Their physicians were not allowed to prescribe for Christian patients. Their men, for cohabiting with a Christian woman, were to be put to death. In 1328, the sermons of a Franciscan friar goaded the Christians of Estella, in Navarre, to massacre 5,000 Jews and burn down their houses. In 1391, the sermons of Fernán Martínez aroused the populace in every major center of Spain to massacre all available Jews who refused conversion. In 1410, Valladolid, and then other cities, moved by the eloquence of the saintly and fanatical Vicente Ferrer, ordered the confinement of Jews and Moors within specified quarters, Juderia, or Alhama, whose gates were to be closed from sunset to sunrise. This segregation, however, was probably for their protection. Patient, laborious, shrewd, taking advantage of every opportunity for development, the Jews multiplied and prospered even under these disabilities. Some kings of Castile, like Alfonso XI and Pedro el Cruel, favored them and raised brilliant Jews to high places in the government. Alfonso made Don Joseph of Écija his minister of finance, and another Jew, Samuel ibn Wakar, his physician. They abused their position, were convicted of intrigue, and died in prison. Samuel Abulafia repeated the sequence. He became state treasurer under Pedro, amassed a large fortune, and was put to death by the king. 3 years earlier, in 1357, Samuel had built at Toledo a classically simple and elegant synagogue, which was changed under Ferdinand into the Christian church of El Tránsito, and is now preserved by the government as a monument of Hebreo-Moorish art in Spain. Pedro's protection of the Jews was their misfortune. When Henry of Trastamara deposed him, 1,200 Jews were massacred by the victorious soldiers, this in Toledo in 1355. And worse slaughters ensued when Henry brought into Spain the free companions recruited by du Guesclin from the rabble of France. Thousands of Spanish Jews preferred baptism to the terror of abuse and pogroms. Being legally Christians, these conversos made their way up the economic and political ladder, in the professions, even in the church. Some became high ecclesiastics, some were counselors to kings. Their talents in finance earned them invidious prominence in the collection and management of the national revenue. Some surrounded themselves with aristocratic comforts, some made their prosperity offensively conspicuous. Angry Catholics fastened upon the conversos the brutal name of marranos, swine. Nevertheless, Christian families with more pedigree than cash, or with a prudent respect for ability, accepted them in marriage. In this way, the Spanish people, especially the upper classes, received a substantial infusion of Jewish blood. Ferdinand the Catholic and Torquemada the Inquisitor had Jews in their ancestry. Pope Paul IV, at war with Philip II, called him and the Spanish the worthless seed of the Jews and Moors. 2. Granada, 1300 to 1492. Ibn Battuta described the situation of Granada as unequaled by any city in the world. Around it on every side are orchards, gardens, flowering meadows, vineyards, and in it noble buildings. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.